Have you ever sat alone in a dark room and wondered if God had forgotten your name? Have you ever stared at a hospital ceiling at 3 in the morning while machines beeped around you and asked yourself why everyone else seemed to be living while you were only surviving? I have. And if someone had told me then that one day I would be sitting in my own living room sharing this story with millions of people around the world, I would have laughed through my tears. Because back then, hope was something I no longer believed in. My name is Sofia Romano. I am 22 years old. I was born in a small town near Florence, Italy, and for most of my childhood, life felt like a beautiful dream. I grew up surrounded by rolling hills, old stone streets, church bells, and the smell of fresh bread drifting through narrow alleyways every morning. My father owned a small bakery. My mother taught music to children. We weren't rich, but we had enough. Enough laughter, enough love, enough happiness. As a little girl, I believed life would always stay that way. I believed every story had a happy ending. I believed bad things only happened to people on television. I was wrong. When I was 16, I began feeling tired all the time. At first, nobody worried. I was studying hard, preparing for exams, helping my parents at the bakery. Everyone assumed I was exhausted, including me. But then, strange symptoms began appearing. My joints hurt, my muscles ached. I started losing weight. Some mornings I couldn't even get out of bed. Doctors gave different explanations. Stress, hormones, teenage fatigue, anxiety. One doctor even suggested I was imagining the symptoms. That hurt more than the illness itself. Years passed, the symptoms grew worse, and still nobody could tell me exactly what was wrong. By the time I turned 20, my life looked nothing like I had imagined. While my friends were traveling, falling in love, and building careers, I was spending my days in waiting rooms in hospitals. Every month brought another specialist, another blood test, another scan, another treatment, another disappointment. Hope became a cycle. A doctor would say, "We think we've found something." My family would celebrate. I would pray. Then the treatment would fail, and everything would collapse again. Over and over, like waves crashing against rocks. Eventually, I stopped getting excited. It was easier to expect disappointment. At least disappointment couldn't surprise me anymore. My parents tried to stay strong, but I could see the fear in their eyes. I could hear my mother crying when she thought I was asleep. I could see my father staring silently at medical bills spread across the kitchen table. The illness wasn't just destroying me. It was hurting everyone who loved me, and that broke my heart. The worst part wasn't the physical pain, it was the loneliness. People don't talk about that enough. When you're sick for a long time, the world keeps moving without you. Friends stop calling, invitations stop arriving. People stop asking how you're doing, not because they're cruel, because life goes on, and eventually you become yesterday's news. One by one, the people around me disappeared, until my world became very small. Just doctors, hospitals, medicines, pain, and silence. One rainy evening, I sat alone in my bedroom staring at a wall. Outside, thunder echoed across the sky. Inside, everything felt empty. I remember opening social media and seeing photographs of former classmates, smiling, getting engaged, graduating, living. Meanwhile, I felt trapped inside a body that refused to cooperate. For the first time in my life, I asked a question that terrified me. What if nothing ever changes? The question stayed with me day after day, night after night. What if this was my future? What if every treatment failed? What if every doctor ran out of answers? What if I spent the rest of my life watching everyone else move forward while I remained stuck? The thought was unbearable, yet it felt increasingly realistic. Then came the appointment that changed everything, or at least I thought it would. A renowned specialist in Milan agreed to review my case. People spoke about him as if he performed miracles. Patients traveled from all over Europe to see him. My parents were hopeful. The doctors were hopeful. Even I allowed myself a little hope. For weeks I imagined hearing the words, "We found the answer." I imagined getting better, going back to school, traveling, starting over. I imagined having a future again. The morning of the appointment we left before sunrise. The drive to Milan felt endless. I spent most of it staring out the window while rain streaked across the glass. When we finally arrived, my heart pounded so hard I thought everyone could hear it. Hours passed, tests, questions, examinations, waiting. Then the specialist entered the room. I immediately searched his face for good news. Instead, I saw something else. Sympathy. And sympathy is often a terrible sign. He sat down, folded his hands, and quietly explained that despite all available testing, there were still no clear answers, no guaranteed treatment, no certainty, no miracle. Just more waiting, more experiments, more hope without promises. The room felt smaller, the air felt heavier. I heard my mother begin crying. My father looked away, and I sat completely still, because something inside me broke, not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, like a candle finally burning out. The drive home was silent. Nobody knew what to say. What could anyone say? Every encouraging phrase sounded empty. Every optimistic sentence felt false. By the time we reached home, darkness had fallen. I went straight to my room, closed the door, and sat on the floor, for hours, alone. Eventually I looked toward the small wooden cross hanging on my wall. It had been there since childhood, a gift from my grandmother. For years it had simply been decoration. A symbol. Nothing more. But that night I stared at it differently. I wasn't angry, I wasn't faithful, I wasn't hopeful. I was exhausted. And in a voice barely louder than a whisper, I said, "Jesus, if you're real, I can't do this anymore." Tears rolled down my face. I've tried every treatment. I've followed every doctor's advice. I've waited. I've hoped, and I'm tired. The room remained silent. No voice answered. No miracle happened. No heavenly light appeared. Nothing. Yet for reasons I couldn't explain, I kept talking. For the first time in years, I spoke honestly. Not polished prayers, not memorized words, just raw pain, raw fear, raw truth. And before I realized it, I was crying harder than I ever had before. Everything came out, every disappointment, every fear, every unanswered question, every broken dream. It felt as though years of pain were pouring out of me. When I finally stopped, I was exhausted. I wiped my eyes, looked once more at the cross, and whispered, "If you're listening, please help me." Then I climbed into bed. Not knowing that night would become the beginning of a journey that would change my life forever. Not because my illness suddenly disappeared, not because doctors suddenly found answers, but because for the first time I had stopped placing all my faith in treatments and had begun searching for something greater, something stronger, something eternal. I didn't know it yet, but my darkest chapter was about to become the doorway to an entirely new life. The morning after that prayer felt exactly like every other morning. I woke up tired, my body still hurt, my illness was still there, and my problems hadn't magically disappeared. For a brief moment, I felt foolish. Maybe I had expected too much. Maybe I had secretly hoped that after crying out to Jesus I would wake up transformed, but nothing had changed. At least that's what I thought. Over the next few weeks, life continued exactly as before. Doctor appointments, medication schedules, blood tests, waiting rooms, questions without answers, the same exhausting cycle. Yet something strange was happening beneath the surface. I found myself thinking about that prayer, again and again, not because I had received an answer, but because it was the first honest prayer I had ever prayed. For years I had known about Jesus. Growing up in Italy, church buildings were everywhere. Crosses hung in homes, religious holidays were part of everyday life. But if I was honest, faith had never been personal. Jesus was someone I had heard about, not someone I truly knew. There's a huge difference between those two things. One afternoon, while organizing old family photographs, I found a picture of my grandmother. She had passed away when I was 17. Looking at her face immediately brought back memories. She had always been the most faithful person in our family. Whenever life became difficult, she would say, "Jesus never wastes pain." As a teenager, I thought those words sounded nice, but I never understood them. Now, sitting alone in my bedroom, I wondered if she had known something I didn't. I opened the drawer beside my bed. Inside was an old Bible she had given me years earlier. The leather cover was worn. Several pages were marked with notes in her handwriting. I hadn't touched it in years. Yet that afternoon I picked it up. At first, I didn't know where to begin. The Bible felt enormous, overwhelming. So I opened it randomly. My eyes landed on a verse in the Gospel of Matthew. "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." I read it again and again and again. Weary, burdened. Those words described me perfectly. For years I had been carrying fear, disappointment, and pain. I was exhausted, not just physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. and for the first time, I wondered whether Jesus understood that exhaustion better than anyone else. That evening, I read more. Then more the next day, then more the day after that. Soon reading became part of my routine. Not because I was searching for religion, I was searching for hope, and somehow, every time I opened those pages, I found a little more. One night, I came across the story of the woman who had suffered for 12 years. 12 years. She had visited doctors, spent money, tried everything, yet nothing helped. Instead, things grew worse. I froze as I read, because for the first time, I saw myself in someone's story. The details were different, but the feelings were the same: the frustration, the disappointment, the endless search for healing. Then I reached the moment where she touched Jesus' garment in faith, and her life changed forever. I closed the Bible and cried. Not because I believed I would instantly be healed, but because, for the first time, I felt understood. I wasn't the only person who had ever suffered. I wasn't the only person who had ever felt hopeless. And somehow that realization brought comfort. Months passed. My physical condition continued to fluctuate. Some days were manageable, others were terrible. There were mornings when I could barely stand, days when pain controlled everything, days when discouragement felt impossible to escape. Yet something else was changing. My relationship with Jesus was becoming real. I began praying every day. Not formal prayers, conversations. Sometimes I thanked him, sometimes I complained. Sometimes I cried, sometimes I sat silently. But little by little, I started feeling less alone. Then came one of the darkest moments of my entire life. A new treatment had shown promise. Doctors were cautiously optimistic. My parents were hopeful again. And despite trying not to, I allowed myself to hope too. For several weeks, things appeared to improve. The symptoms seemed lighter. My energy increased. For the first time in years, I imagined a future again. I imagined going back to university, traveling, building a career, living. Then everything collapsed. The treatment failed, worse than before. My symptoms returned aggressively. Within days, I felt sicker than I had in months. I remember sitting on the bathroom floor after receiving the news. I couldn't stop shaking. I had invested so much hope into that treatment, and now it was gone, again. Another failure, another disappointment, another broken promise. That night, anger filled my heart. I locked my bedroom door, dropped to my knees, and cried out, "Why, Jesus?" The words echoed through the room. Why would you let me hope if this was going to happen? Tears streamed down my face. I trusted you. I prayed. I believed. And nothing changed. For several minutes, I sat there sobbing. Then something unexpected happened. A memory surfaced. A verse I had read days earlier. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't supernatural. But it felt deeply personal. The verse said, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Weakness. That word hit me hard. Because I hated weakness. I hated needing help. I hated feeling dependent. I hated being vulnerable. Yet according to Scripture, weakness wasn't where God abandoned people. It was often where he met them. That thought stayed with me, and over the following weeks, I began seeing my situation differently. Not as punishment, not as proof that God didn't care, but as a place where I could learn to trust him more deeply. The transformation wasn't instant. I still struggled, I still doubted, I still cried. But something fundamental had changed. My faith was no longer based on getting healed. It was based on knowing Jesus. And surprisingly, that brought peace. One Sunday afternoon, while scrolling through videos online, I found a Christian testimony. A young woman shared how she had battled illness for years. At one point, she said, "Jesus didn't only heal my body, he healed my heart before he healed anything else." Those words struck me, because that's exactly what seemed to be happening in my life. My circumstances remained difficult, yet inside I wasn't the same person anymore. Fear no longer controlled every thought. Despair no longer filled every day. For the first time in years, hope was returning. Not hope in medicine, not hope in doctors, not hope in treatments, hope in Christ. And then something happened that I never saw coming, something that would change not only my health but my entire future. It began with an unexpected invitation. A simple invitation that almost seemed insignificant. Yet looking back now, I believe it was one of the most important moments of my life, because that invitation would lead me to a place where I would experience God's presence in a way I never had before. and it would become the turning point in a story that I once believed had no happy ending. The invitation came from someone I barely knew. Her name was Isabella. We had met months earlier in a hospital waiting room. At the time, we exchanged a few polite words and never expected to see each other again. But somehow we stayed in touch. Occasionally, she would send me encouraging messages. Simple things. A Bible verse, a prayer, a reminder that she was thinking about me. One afternoon, Isabella called unexpectedly. After a few minutes of conversation, she asked, "Sophia, would you come to church with me this weekend?" I hesitated. I had attended church services before, mostly during holidays, weddings, funerals, family traditions. But this felt different. This wasn't about tradition. This was about faith, real faith. And honestly, I wasn't sure I belonged there. Seeing my hesitation, Isabella said gently, "You don't need to have everything figured out. Just come." For several days I thought about it. Part of me wanted to stay home. That felt safer, but another part of me felt strangely drawn to the invitation. Finally, I agreed. Sunday arrived. I almost canceled 3 times. My anxiety was overwhelming. What if people judged me? What if I didn't fit in? What if I felt nothing? Yet somehow I got dressed and went. The church wasn't what I expected. It wasn't grand or intimidating. It felt warm, welcoming, real. People smiled. They greeted me. Nobody pressured me. Nobody demanded anything from me. They simply welcomed me. And after years of feeling forgotten by the world, that simple kindness touched my heart. Then the worship began. Music filled the room. People raised their hands, some closed their eyes, others quietly prayed. And for reasons I couldn't explain, tears started filling my eyes. I wasn't emotional because of the music. I was emotional because something deep inside me felt seen. For years I had carried pain nobody fully understood. But sitting there, surrounded by strangers worshiping Jesus, I felt a peace I couldn't explain. Then the pastor began speaking. The message was about storms, about how Jesus never promised a life without suffering, but he promised his presence in the middle of suffering. I listened carefully. Every sentence felt personal. Every word seemed directed at my heart. Then the pastor said something I will never forget. Sometimes God doesn't immediately remove the storm. Sometimes he teaches us to trust him in the storm. The room fell silent, and I felt those words hit me like lightning. Because for years I had been asking one question, "Jesus, why won't you take this away?" But perhaps I had been asking the wrong question. Perhaps the greater question was, "Jesus, will you stay with me through it?" And suddenly I knew the answer. Yes, he already had. Through every hospital visit, every sleepless night, every failed treatment, every tear, every disappointment, Jesus had never left me. I was the one who had spent years looking everywhere except toward him. After the service ended, many people left, but I remained seated, unable to move, unable to stop crying. For the first time in years, the weight on my chest felt lighter. Not gone, but lighter. And that mattered a lot. That evening, when I returned home, something extraordinary happened. I sat alone in my room, opened my Bible, and began praying. At first, my words were ordinary. Then suddenly they weren't. Because for the first time, I wasn't praying for healing. I wasn't praying for answers. I wasn't praying for a miracle. Instead, I said, "Jesus, even if nothing changes, I want to know you." The moment those words left my mouth, I felt something shift inside me, a surrender, a release. For years, I had been holding tightly to fear, to control, to expectations. Now I was placing everything in his hands, my future, my health, my dreams, my life. And strangely enough, that surrender brought freedom. The next several months became a season of spiritual growth unlike anything I had ever experienced. I joined a Bible study group, I made Christian friends, I spent time praying, reading scripture, learning what it truly meant to follow Christ, and slowly, Jesus became the center of my life. Not illness, not fear, not uncertainty. Jesus. The illness was still there, but it no longer defined me. For the first time, I understood something profound. My identity wasn't found in being a patient, or a diagnosis, or a medical mystery. My identity was found in being loved by God, and that changed everything. One night, several months later, our Bible study group gathered for prayer. We met in a small room behind the church. There were about 20 people there. Nothing dramatic, nothing unusual, just ordinary believers praying together. Toward the end of the evening, someone asked if they could pray for me. I nodded. Several people gathered around, placed their hands gently on my shoulders and began praying. Their prayers were simple, heartfelt, full of faith. As they prayed, I felt overwhelming emotion rising inside me. Not excitement, not adrenaline. Peace. Deep peace. The kind of peace that feels impossible to describe. The kind that reaches places inside your soul that words cannot touch. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in years, every fear disappeared. Not temporarily, completely. In that moment, I knew something with absolute certainty. No matter what happened next, I belonged to Jesus. Whether I was healed or not, whether life became easier or harder, whether my future looked the way I hoped or not, I belonged to Him. And that realization changed everything. When I returned home that night, my mother noticed something different. She looked at me carefully and asked, "What happened?" I smiled through tears and answered, "I found peace." She stared at me for several seconds. Then she started crying, because she had spent years watching me suffer. And for the first time in a very long time, she saw genuine joy in my eyes. Not forced optimism, not pretending. Real joy, the kind only God can give. But what none of us knew was that another surprise was coming. A surprise none of the doctors expected. A surprise that would leave my family speechless. Because while Jesus had already transformed my heart, something remarkable was about to happen to my body as well. And it would begin with a routine medical appointment that almost didn't happen. A routine appointment that would become one of the most unforgettable days of my life. The appointment almost didn't happen. A few days before it was scheduled, I considered canceling. After years of disappointing results, hospital visits had become emotionally exhausting. Every appointment seemed to follow the same pattern. Hope, waiting, disappointment, repeat. I was tired of the cycle, tired of expectations, tired of being let down. But my mother insisted. "Just one more appointment," she said. So I agreed, not because I expected good news, but because I loved her. The morning of the appointment felt strangely ordinary. The sky above Florence was gray. Rain tapped softly against the car windows as we drove. My father focused on the road. My mother quietly prayed under her breath, and I stared out the window, watching the countryside pass by. Part of me wondered if anything would ever change. Another part of me no longer cared. Not because I had given up, but because my peace no longer depended on the outcome. That was new. Months earlier, every appointment controlled my emotions. Now something was different. I had found stability in Jesus. For the first time, my faith wasn't attached to results. It was attached to Him. When we arrived, everything felt familiar. The waiting room, the paperwork, the smell of disinfectant, the nervous patients, the anxious families. I had lived this scene hundreds of times. Eventually, my name was called. The examination lasted nearly an hour. More questions, more tests, more measurements, more waiting. Then the doctor left the room, and we waited again. 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes. Long enough for anxiety to begin creeping back into my mind. I noticed my mother twisting her hands together, my father pacing slowly. Nobody spoke. Finally, the door opened. The doctor entered, carrying several reports. At first, his expression confused me. He didn't look concerned. He didn't look sympathetic. He looked surprised, very surprised. He sat down, looked at the reports, looked at me, then looked back at the reports. Several seconds passed. Finally, he spoke. "Sophia?" He paused, almost as if searching for the right words. Then he said, "Your results are significantly better." Nobody reacted, because none of us understood what he meant. The doctor continued. Several inflammatory markers had dropped dramatically. Certain symptoms that had previously been worsening were now improving. Some abnormalities had stabilized. Others had nearly disappeared. The room went silent. I stared at him. Surely I had misunderstood. But he kept talking. And the more he explained, the more unbelievable it sounded. For the first time in years, the overall trend wasn't negative. It was positive. The doctor wasn't claiming a complete cure. He wasn't promising perfection. But he was saying something we hadn't heard in a very long time. Improvement. Real improvement. When the appointment ended, my mother was crying, my father was crying, and honestly, so was I. Not because a miracle had suddenly erased every symptom, but because after years of darkness, we finally saw light. As we walked out of the hospital, my father stopped in the parking lot, wrapped his arms around me, and simply held me. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The tears on his face said everything. For years, he had felt powerless watching his daughter suffer. And now, for the first time, hope felt real again. That night, our family sat around the dinner table together, something we hadn't done peacefully in a long time. Illness had dominated our conversations for years, but that evening felt different. We laughed, we smiled, we thanked God, and before the meal began, my father did something unexpected. He stood up, folded his hands, and prayed aloud. My father wasn't known for showing emotion, yet tears filled his eyes as he thanked Jesus for carrying our family through the hardest years of our lives. I don't think there was a dry eye at the table. Over the following months, improvement continued, slowly, steadily, not overnight, not dramatically, but consistently. I regained strength, energy returned, pain decreased. Activities that once seemed impossible became possible again. I started taking long walks, then traveling short distances, then returning to some of the dreams I had abandoned years earlier. Every small victory felt enormous, and every step forward reminded me how far God had already brought me. Yet the greatest miracle wasn't happening inside my body. It had already happened inside my heart. Because years earlier, if my health had improved, I would have built my entire identity around recovery. Now I understood something deeper. Jesus had become my foundation. Not circumstances, not outcomes, not health. Him. One evening, nearly a year after that appointment, I stood alone on a hill overlooking Florence. The sun was setting behind the city. Golden light covered the rooftops. Church bells echoed through the distance. And for a long time I simply stood there, thinking, remembering, reflecting. I remembered the hospital rooms, the tears, the fear, the loneliness, the nights when I thought life would never get better, the moments when I felt forgotten, the days when hope seemed impossible. And suddenly I realized something. If God had instantly healed me years earlier, I might never have truly known him. I might have received the miracle, but missed the Savior. And somehow that thought changed everything. Because the greatest gift God gave me wasn't healing. The greatest gift was himself. The peace, the presence, the relationship, the faith that carried me when nothing else could. Today, as I sit here in my living room telling you this story, I am 22 years old, and my life looks very different from what I once imagined. Some challenges remain, some questions remain unanswered, but hope has returned, joy has returned, purpose has returned, and most importantly, Jesus is at the center of it all. If you're listening to my story right now from a hospital bed, from a waiting room, from a lonely apartment, from a place of heartbreak, I want you to hear this. I know what it feels like to run out of answers. I know what it feels like to lose hope. I know what it feels like to wonder whether God sees your pain. But please don't give up, because sometimes God's greatest work begins when we reach the end of ourselves. Sometimes faith grows in places where nothing else can survive, and sometimes the miracle isn't what God changes around you, it's what he changes within you. Years ago, I whispered a desperate prayer through tears. Jesus, if you're listening, please help me. At the time, I thought heaven was silent. I thought nobody heard me. I thought I was alone, but I wasn't. Jesus heard every word, every tear, every fear, every sleepless night, every broken dream, and step by step, through years of struggle, he led me from despair to hope, from fear to faith, from darkness to light. So when people ask me today what saved my life, I don't begin by talking about doctors or treatments or medical breakthroughs. Those things mattered, and I am deeply grateful for them. But the first thing I tell them is this: I lost hope in every treatment. Then I found faith in Jesus. And that changed everything.